Hey everyone, so this is another video that I did from last year. This is the Brooklyn Bridge, which is ahead of you, and this is running back to where I was staying in Central Park. Originally I wasn't going to do much voiceover in this video because, excuse my ignorance, but I didn't think it was too interesting a run. Obviously, you can tell by my accent, I am not from New York, I am from England, and I suppose I only really knew the famous bits along the run, so Brooklyn Bridge, Flatiron Building, Empire State Building, Central Park, but I didn't realise the history of the street I basically run, so I don't get lost, because if you've seen any of my videos I get lost all the time. I just stuck to Broadway because it goes all the way up. I can't get lost, I just stick on this one street. But it's a very interesting street and there's lots of very interesting things. Of course, New York is one of the most famous cities in the world. Why wouldn't it be incredibly interesting and have very interesting things? So for the last couple of days I've been doing a bit of research about this run, and I'm going to try and tell you during the run the odd thing that I have discovered while you enjoy the scenery. Feel free to turn me off if you so desire. But yeah, I just thought I'd give a little introduction on what I'm going to try and do on this video. I hope you enjoy the scenery. Thank you for watching. So for starters, I'll go just personally why I wanted to do this run. It's not a run unlike Central Park, which I always wanted to do. I don't know why I wanted to see Brooklyn Bridge at sunrise, but I did. It became a goal about being in New York. I can't say I overly thought about doing this run the last time I was here. I don't know what spurred me to run from Brooklyn Bridge to Central Park. What I did is I got the subway from Central Park West, which is where this video ends up, the exact spot, and I got it to City Hall, and then where the video started I just started, and it turned out to be exactly 10k, so if you're doing this on a treadmill or whatever, this is a slow 10k. So I'll start doing a couple of the little bits after basically when I turn back around on Brooklyn Bridge, because it's all pretty around here, so I'll leave you with the scenery. So, Brooklyn Bridge celebrated its 135th birthday in the year 2018. So, what's that, 1883? 1883, or give or take a year or two, is when the bridge was built and put there. Originally on the Manhattan side, which is where we are now, they had wine cellars underneath, which were, the one on the Manhattan side was called the Blue Grotto, and they were all closed in the 1930s. Also on the Manhattan side, discovered in 2006 were old Cold War bomb shelters. As I said, they were founded in 2006 when city workers were just doing routine inspections, and they found lots of supplies in the shelters. The supplies that they found were ink stamped from significant years from the Cold War period. These being 1957, which was the year Sputnik launched, and also 1962, which was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I found it fascinating that it was just forgotten about until 2006. And we're just heading back to where we started the run, and then I head for Broadway, and we go north all the way up to Central Park. Forgive me for not going through the skyline that I just passed. I'm not sure all the building names. I could have found out, but the buildings. The one on the right with the little column at the top, which I'm heading towards, that's the David N. Dinks Municipal Building. When it was built in 1914, it was the fourth tallest building in New York City. You are allowed to the top of it, and you get a 360 view of New York City. It was the home of WNYC Radio, which was the first radio station that broke the news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. So that news was first broke in that building to the American public. So when I get to the end of Brooklyn Bridge, I go through City Hall Park, and then from there I pick up Broadway. So within 3 minutes on Broadway, and I stay on that road all the way to Central Park. Like I said at the start, when I was doing this run, I didn't think it was too interesting a run, and I wouldn't have anything to say. But I'm very wrong. Obviously Broadway is a very famous street, but it's also a very historical street. It's one of the oldest thoroughfares in the whole of America. You can date the road back to the Dutch and of New Amsterdam of 1624. And Broadway, the road, was used to transport livestock from what is now Wall Street all the way to Union Square. The street is 13 miles long. It goes on for a heck of a long time. It goes from Lower Manhattan all the way to the Bronx. It was obviously on the first printed maps of New York City. It's one of the oldest streets in the whole of America. Like I said, you can date the road back to 1624, which in American terms is the dawn of time. So just the street in itself is very interesting, let alone the things through the ages that appear on the streets. So the name of the street, Broadway, and what that is synonymous with now, was originally called Herald Square. That was when the Dutch had possession of it, That meant Gentleman Street. The Dutch widened it, but when the English took over in 1664, they called it Broadway because of the width of the street. Now this is coming into City Hall Park. City Hall Park was once the site of public executions during the American Revolution. Also, if you're in, like, I know everyone's kind of into abandoned stuff these days, City Hall Station, which is underneath here, that is like a very famous abandoned underground station in New York. It's kind of the Aldwych of New York. I don't know, like Aldwych seems to be like the famous abandoned tube station in London. It's architecturally very beautiful. It's got the glass tiles still there, the chandeliers are still there. It was closed in 1945 as the new trains that they were using there's a corner that runs through the station, the track, and the trains got too big for the corner. I think that's what happened with Aldwych as well. But you can do tours of it, not like weekly or anything, but there's certain days that they do tours of it. But yeah, City Hall Park. So this is the junction of Broadway and Chambers Street. Like a few of my more recent videos, I've put where the streets are as I run down them, and in this case the junctions. This is 280 Broadway, and it's not really well known in New York anymore. But I didn't notice the building on the right, which I'm about to run by. You'll notice it runs the whole block. This is called the Stewart building, or the Sun building. It was noted as a marble miracle. If you look at it's the building on the right, if you notice it's going the whole block. It was one of the most celebrated buildings in New York City. It is deemed as the first department store in the whole of America. It's one of the oldest non-residential buildings in New York. It's also classed as one of the most influential buildings of the 19th century. I certainly didn't notice when I ran by it, hence I didn't look at it. Also, during the First World War, it was a British military recruitment station for expats that were living in America and Canada, and I'll link it. They designed like a little poster for it, and I've already put the little poster up on screen. That was for that building, the Stewart building in New York City. This bit, which is between Leonard Street and Franklin Street, this was in the 19th century one of the most fashionable districts in New York. But to the left, I'll put an arrow there. That's 359 Broadway, which was the studio of Matthew Brady, who's an incredibly famous photographer. If you're an American, you've probably seen one of his pictures, stroke portraits every day, because it's the portrait of Abraham Lincoln that's used on the $5 bill. He was famous for taking pictures of most of the famous people, American people that were alive in his lifetime, including 18 of the 19 presidents up until his death. What he is most famous for, though, is his pictures of the American Civil War. That's his fame. The way he documented the Civil War has been used by historians to more accurately tell what happened. He photographed people on both sides. He nearly every most famous pictures of the American Civil War were taken by Matthew Brady. The building now, 359, is a protected building, I believe, because of the work that he conducted there. But I think now it's an American haunted house thing, which sounds pretty cool to me. But I didn't know that again when I was running by it. But yeah, that's Matthew Brady's old studio was 359 Broadway. So this leads us to Canal Street. So now this is SoHo area of New York City. SoHo in New York, opposed to London, means south of Houston Street, and to the east, like a block or so, is Chinatown in New York. So the SoHo area of New York is kind of synonymous with the term, the famous term of starving artists. My starving artist face. In the 50s and the 60s, it was like an industrial area and had lots of abandoned, like, little lofts and areas that people could just kind of squat in. And it was kind of like the trendy hip area, and it became the trendy hip area, and today it is a trendy hip area, but more for the rich and famous. I think to look at New York City today, and the metropolis that it is, and the holiday destination that it is for so many people, I think a lot of people, obviously I'm not a New Yorker, but I think a lot of people from like outside of America, and Americans, if you don't know your modern history, if you looked at New York from the 1970s, it was just hell. It was just a broken city. Nearly all the manufacturing jobs, which is what served it, was just lost. Nearly, I can't remember the figures, but there was a certain percentage of New Yorkers that were dependent on welfare in 1975. Rapes and burglaries and car thefts just went to ridiculous numbers. It was just one of the most dangerous cities in the world, only in the 1970s. I mean, Central Park, which you saw my last video, I ran through, and it's a beautiful park. I mean, if you look at it from the 70s, have you seen pictures of it from the 70s? It is just... It's really interesting. I would love to... Oh, there's a Friends reference on the left. I'd love to do a compare and contrast pictures of Central Park from the 70s. But all this is leading to the but. The creativity that was going on in New York City in the 70s, the art, the music, it just was one of the most creative hubs of the last century was the 1970s in New York. And this is SoHo, this is kind of where it was all thriving. So it's pretty interesting for that. One of the most famous artists from this time was Donald Judd, and that's a Nike building straight ahead of me there, and to the left, but you can just see at the end, just at the end of that block, that's his old studio, and it's an example of the SoHo lofts that the artist moved into. You can do tours around there now. I will also have to talk about David Bowie. He lived in this area of New York from 1999 up until his death. He considered himself a New Yorker at death. He said he had lived there longer than he had lived anywhere else in his life, and he considered himself a New Yorker. And there's lots of little haunts and stuff you can go to if you're a David Bowie fan around this area. If you did a right here, about a block away to Lafayette Street, that was his own old apartment, and that building to the right now, that was his local grocery store. Just a block to the right is where his old apartment in New York was, up until his death. There's lots of stuff you can do if you're into David Bowie, which you should be. If you're not, you just haven't heard him, because he's amazing. There's lots of stuff in New York you can go to. His favourite spot was Washington Park, which is just to the west of me. Now, I'll point it out better in about 2 seconds. I'm sure if you want to go, you can just Google, but I'll point out what street you need to go down if you want to go down it in 2 seconds. North of Euston, so we are now in the SoHo district of New York, and also we're kind of in the Greenwich Village area of New York, but that's all to the left, the big Greenwich Village, famous sights and sounds. Greenwich Village is like Bob Dylan fans. It's where Bob Dylan used to hang around. The Freewheeling album cover is if I remember, that's Jones Street, which is quite a bit further. Robert Mapplethorpe's the photographer, and Patti Smith, who were a couple. Robert Mapplethorpe's studio was on Bond Street. That street I just came on, he was like just a block away, was his old studio. The Patti Smith album cover Horses wasn't taken in that studio, I don't believe. I think that was in an apartment in Greenwich Village, this is now all kind of Greenwich Village area. There's also a walk you can do for Bob Dylan, a bit like the David Bowie walk, but that would be a block or two to the left, where all his old haunts. Greenwich Village is also the home of Wonder Woman, and also the Alfred Hitchcock film Rear Window, that was set in Greenwich Village. Not sure if it was filmed or not in Greenwich Village. I would also like to point out that a lot of the things I point out, as you can probably tell by the quirky nature, are things I'm into. Greenwich Village is famed for other things, and a lot more celebrities live in Greenwich Village than Wonder Woman. But there you go. If you want to go celebrity spotting, I'm sure Greenwich Village is the place, along with SoHo. And if you did want to go to Washington Arch, the Washington Park, that's now, if you went down that street to the left, east. And apparently that was David Bowie's favourite spot in the whole of New York. And also Bob Dylan hung about in there as well. Again, I'm sure lots more people do, and I'm just picking out people I like. It's New York, everybody's here. Just heading towards Union Park, and I'll pick back up with you in about 2 minutes. The street that I'm coming up to is Astor Place, and if you did a right here to Lafayette Street, the street in itself is only a block long, so a very small street. You would have found Astor Place Opera House. It's now, guess what, a Starbucks, because New York City needs more Starbucks. But the reason the Opera House is famous, or infamous to this day, is because in 1849 one of the most violent riots in the city took place. A riot which was predominantly a fan riot about who was the better Macbeth actor, or Shakespearean actor, but the play that was going on was Macbeth. William McReady was an English actor, and Edwin Forrest was an American actor, and the Irish immigrants and other people had a lot of issues with the English due to the famine, and it basically became an anti-English riot. But yeah, it was one of the most deadly riots in the history of New York City. 22 people died, and it was kinda about who was the best Shakespearean actor. And the poster that I've added in the top left was a poster that was used to entice the riot and was aimed to incense working class Irish and Americans. So you'll notice this very long straight road all of a sudden curves left now, and from here, this is 10th Street, it will be diagonal for up until 79th Street, it just goes in this diagonal path. Not overly sure why. It's not because of the church, which was what people thought. The road was there before the church, and also this street, 11th Street, which doesn't, as you'll notice, all the other streets go through. This one doesn't go through. And this was because Henry Brevet's orchard was there when the road was when they were doing 11th Street, so it wasn't allowed to go through his orchard because he managed to convince the city that he needed his orchard, and that's why 11th Street doesn't go through. But why the road tilts left, they think there was a road there, and I can't remember the name of the road, but it wasn't allowed to meet that road, so it went off into its little left diagonal shape, and it goes slightly left or west all the way up until 79th Street. So this is Union Square Park, which was an old potter's field, so it was an old graveyard for the poor. It was synonymous with demonstrations in New York City. In 1861, there was a rally of over 100,000 people during the Civil War. In the olden days, the city was required to construct places for people to protest, and Union Square in New York was such. It's most famous for it was the first ever Labor Day parade in the whole of America, and it took place in Union Square Park in 1882. Also, 2 presidents' funeral processions went through the Union Square Park. If you would like to guess, you may. They are Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. I hope you weren't expecting a prize if you did get it right. I am in no position to give prizes. So we're now coming into the Flatiron district, or we are in the Flatiron district. But at the moment we're coming up to 20th Street, and about 5 or 6 doors down on the right here was the birthplace of the 26th president, and that would have been Theodore Roosevelt, who was the first president born in New York City to take presidency. He was also the youngest president of the United States of America at 42 years old, and he took office after the assassination of William McKinley. Right, so when I emerge from under that canopy, I will start to be able to see the Empire State Building, and the Flatiron Building will come on the left. The Empire State Building will be, well, in the sky, in the distance, as you can see. We'll start with the Empire State Building. It was opened in 1931. It was the tallest building in the world. That was until 1970, when it was overtaken by the World Trade Center. The myth of it being a docking station for airships is just that, although it was originally proposed, and there are those famous images of a Zeppelin docking there. That never did happen. There is a 103rd floor, and we, as in the public, are allowed onto the 102nd floor for the famous views over New York City. I think it's 83rd, the 83rd floor. That's the Flatiron Building. Is where you're allowed outside, and the 102nd floor is when you're behind the glass. But there's a 103rd floor, and I will put a picture up, and well, you can see that has a very low ledge at certain places, and besides that, it is not open for the public, and it is only open for basically celebrities, as far as I can make out. The lights that shine on top of the Empire State Building, there it is. The first ever one light that is now very famous. The first light was a beacon, and it was a beacon to say that Roosevelt had been elected president of the United States of America. We get a good view of the Flatiron Building now. That was a big sigh. I must have been feeling it at this point. Going back to the Empire State Building, I'll put a picture up. This is my favourite story from either of the buildings. That is Evelyn McHale. The picture is from May the 1st, 1947. A sad story, she jumped from the observation deck and fell 86 floors to her death. Her body landed on the bonnet of a UN Cadillac, and a young chap called Robert Wiles, who was a photography student, took that image, which is now very infamous. It was used by Time magazine, and it was titled "The Most Beautiful Suicide." It was titled that because of how peaceful she looked. She looked asleep and very at ease. Unfortunately for Evelyn McHale, her dying wish was that no one would see her body, and it is now such an iconic image. But I'm not overly sure why you're jumping from the Empire State Building if you don't want your body to be seen. But I'm not here to judge. She was engaged to be married, but the note that she left stated that she wouldn't make a good wife for anyone, which I find incredibly tragic and sad. The image was also used by Andy Warhol, and it was used in the print Suicide, brackets, fallen body, close brackets. And quickly, the Flatiron Building was opened on November the 19th, 1902, with its water-powered elevators, which I find truly bonkers. It was originally called the Fuller Building. It's never been the tallest of buildings, but it was always one of the most photographed because of the way it looks. In the basement was the Tavern Lewis, which then became a speakeasy, and it was visited by Irving Berlin. And the irony of this is we are now on Tin Pan Alley. So this is West 28th Street, in between 5th and 6th, which is known as Tin Pan Alley. Irving Berlin being a very famous member of Tin Pan Alley. It was called Tin Pan Alley because of a journalist who was on the street and said all the pianos playing made it sound like a Tin Pan Alley. You can date Tin Pan Alley to 1885, and where it runs to, people debate it to be the 30s, others say rock and roll of the 50s finally killed it off. What Tin Pan Alley was basically a collection of songwriters and music publishers in one space. This came about because in the mid-19th century, copyright wasn't really strict, and if somebody had a song, like a hit song, the melody would just be reused over and over for different songs. If you don't know what a melody is, think of a song and whistle it. What you whistle is normally the melody. But at the end of the 19th century, copyright became more strict, and so they would ban lyricists, songwriters, composers, publicists all together at Tin Pan Alley, and they would work together and just write songs and just churn out songs. It was like working 9 to 5, but your job's a songwriter. And you would just take it to different people in the building. Somebody would do the lyrics, somebody would do the music, someone would do the melody, etc., etc. And the most famous being Irving Berlin, who wrote White Christmas. I don't believe that was written as a Tin Pan Alley song, but that's why you all know Irving Berlin, and that's the song you'll all know by Irving Berlin. So we're getting into what seems to be a more populated area. We're getting closer to Times Square. And earlier in the video at 280 Broadway, I discussed about the first ever department store. We are now getting to the world's biggest department store. Although I believe there's one in South Korea that's bigger, but we won't mention that. Well, that's the ploy of Macy's, I believe. Anyway, the most interesting thing about Macy's is there's 5 Starbucks inside. 5. In New York, where there's one on every corner. Anyway, this is Macy's is not H&M, it's the red building on the corner. It's the Herald Square Macy's, so the famous flagship one. Now, the reason the red corner with the shopping bag is there was because originally somebody had bought that building to stop it becoming the world's largest department store. And he thought that would stop it from being so because he owned the corner and they couldn't develop out that far, but they just built all the way around it. That's why there's a weird corner there. They now lease that building, that 5-story building, and they put their red Macy's shopping bag there. Probably as a reminder, as you know, they won. They won the battle of the world's biggest department stores. I've been to New York City twice. I've never been into Macy's. I know a lot of people go to Macy's. To be honest, I didn't really know what it was. Macy's isn't a English thing. There's probably one in London. Empire State Building again. Yeah, never been into Macy's. Both times I've been to New York, it's been at the end of a trip. So I've always had no money, so forgive me. I might go to Macy's one day. I hear they do the odd Starbucks. Anyway, this is Herald Square area. We are fast approaching Times Square. I think I was tapping out of this part of the run, hence I stood on the corner for so long. I don't know why I didn't run a bit further. Bless me, I think I was tired. It's 7:30 on that clock, so it's probably why it's quiet. If you've been here, it's mega busy. 7:30 in the morning and probably a weekend. Herald Square is named after the newspaper, the New York Herald, because its headquarters was on the square. Like most of New York in the early 1800s, it was countryside. Herald Square was a farm, and the reason this is of interest is because the farm was owned by Francisco Bastiani, who was one of the only black men to own land in New York before the abolition of slavery. This is the garment district of New York City, which is like the fashion district, and as I know not a lot about that, I will probably just keep my big mouth closed until we get to Times Square, which is just straight ahead. So still on Broadway, just heading straight up. Oh, Dunkin' Donuts, how I miss you. West 37th Street. So if you did a left here, down a block, is the little restaurant that's in a freight elevator. I tell you, if you like quirky, get yourself to New York City. Anyway, I'll catch up with you all at Times Square. So this is coming up to West 42nd Street, and the wall green building that you see straight ahead, that is 1 Times Square. The area to the left, which would be between 7th and 8th Street, in the 1970s and 80s was one of the worst areas of New York City. It was filled with drug dealers and prostitutes, and that particular stretch where we just were at 42nd Street, if you'd done a left there in between in that area, was lined with pornographic theatres back in the 70s and 80s. It's said to be one of the worst areas in New York City at a particularly terrible time for New York City. Number 1 Times Square is where the famous New Year ball is stored. Also, the only business that's in 1 Times Square is that Walgreens that is on ground level. It was bought in the mid-90s, and basically it is just domed with billboards, and that's how it makes so much money. It is worth an estimated $495 million. And it was sold for less than $30 million in the mid-90s. It's a 25-floor building, and apart from the Walgreens, what was that woman doing? It is completely empty. Times Square is named Times Square, a little bit like Herald Square that we passed earlier, because it is named after the newspaper, because its headquarters were there in 1904. See, that's the New York Times paper, and it took the name Times Square. The area that we're in, which is between 42nd and 53rd Street, was originally nicknamed as the Great White Way, because in the 1890s it was one of the first streets to be totally illuminated with electric light. Talk about, I've poorly arrowed. There you go. That's the one on the corner of 46. That was recently restored. It had a TGI Fridays billboard over the top of it for years and years, and they didn't maintain the building. It was an old Millers and Co building, and they used to make shoes for all the Broadway plays and stuff. All the actors and actresses would go in, and it was really architecturally very pretty building, and it wasn't looked after. It was in really poor state. And then Express took over the billboard. It's that billboard with the pretty lady on it. That was on the left corner just then. And they restored the whole building with it, and it's like underneath the billboards and the lights, there's some very pretty buildings in Times Square, architecturally beautiful. I just thought that was really fascinating. Just the no matter how much you paint over it, there's still the history is underneath. And I suppose if people wanted all the billboards down and stuff, then the billboards would be missed as well. So I just thought it was really interesting that there's such a beautiful building on the corner of Times Square, but it's beautiful in the sense of the architecture and not the bright lights. But I just thought I'd point that out. The huge building in the middle there that's being developed. I was curious about it when I was in New York. So that is Central Park Tower being developed, and once completed it will be the highest residential building in the world. It is part of Billionaires Row, so I wouldn't go saving your pocket money to try and get an apartment there. Chances are you won't be able to afford it. I won't go into a little rant about the homeless situation in America and places costing absolute fortunes to live in, but I would be amiss if I was to talk about music in New York City and not mention jazz. New Orleans is the birthplace of jazz, but they say New York is the home of jazz. If you see some of my other videos, New Orleans is my favourite American city, so there's quite a bit of information on jazz and stuff in New Orleans, excuse me. But 52nd Street, which we will get to, was the swing street of jazz of the 1930s and 1950s. If you can think of a famous jazz musician, they would have played on 52nd Street. Duke Ellington, Thelonious Monk, Miles Davis, Billie Holiday, all played on one of the many different jazz clubs that were on 52nd Street. There was about 20 in between 5th and 7th Avenue jazz clubs. It was just the swinging street. And I'll put a little picture up, and that's how 52nd Street would have looked in the 1950s. And now this is 52nd Street here. Again, it was more a block to the right, but it was all, the swing street was that street to the right, and it also came to this part. And on this road, which is Broadway, as I've said, on the right, the buildings have gone, was Birdland, which was a very famous jazz club. We're now coming up to probably the two most famous theatres in New York. The first one is Broadway, which was showing West Side Story when I was running by it. There we go. But the second one, and for me a lot more interesting, if not quite as famous, is the one I'm coming up to, which is the Ed Sullivan Theatre, which you can probably guess where this is going. It was the home of the Ed Sullivan Show, and of course its probably most famous performance was when the Beatles just rocked up, and that's the theatre here on the left. The Beatles played there in February of 1964 and landed the day before. And an estimated 73 million people tuned in to see what the fuss was about these Scousers with long hair coming over. And they killed it. And they became what they became and changed a lot. A lot that we probably don't appreciate that they changed to this day. Or maybe we do. Depends who you are. But they played a couple of times on the Ed Sullivan show. Even on that day, they performed the set that everybody watched in the afternoon. They rehearsed all day there. George Harrison had tonsillitis, so Neil Aspinall had to fill in. And yeah, it was the start of the Beatles in America, like another step for the Beatles becoming what they became. I will just clear up, Neil Aspinall played the rehearsals for George. He didn't obviously play the famous set because that would be silly. He just stood there so they could get the positions right for the TV. Thank you. It's interesting, obviously, that Beatles performance to see or to think why they were so big. Why they were so big in America particularly. Obviously they were huge in England. But like the whole Beatlemania term was from America. And I suppose if you looked at it, you could say it was almost something for people to cling on to. It was only a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis and weeks after JFK was assassinated that it happened. It being the Beatles playing the Ed Sullivan show. And you could look at that. America was just needing good news. They just needed something to gravitate to. And the unknown of these young lads with guitars with a funny accent who were very witty and charming and could write a killer melody probably just did it. So they were obviously the best band ever, but obviously circumstances that arose probably made it the phenomenon that it was. But I suppose that's up for debate, but that's just my take on it. So we go from probably the most famous performance of all time to the most unfamous performance of all time, which is one of my YouTube videos, which I've mentioned several times before, when I walked back from Central Park to do my big run and I slipped on the curb and I was nearly in tears in the middle of New York City. That incident happened just on that little island there where I'm taking a picture. That's where I was nearly in agony, and well, I wasn't nearly in agony, I was in agony, but nearly in tears, and all these people were just looking at me in bits. 6'4" man. Yeah. But a big goal of mine was to run by it when I had an ankle, as it nearly destroyed my trip in America last time. So, nice little segue from the Beatles to me. So I perfectly segued from the Beatles to myself, and from myself the only natural progression is to Christopher Columbus, which is good because we were at Columbus Circle, built or put there in the late 19th century. It was an ode to Paris, like the big roundabouts in Paris. It was once originally designed to be a part of Central Park, which is straight out here. We are basically in Central Park. But the monument and the circle was once in Central Park, or designed to be in Central Park. Is the geographical centre of New York City. So, if you see a sign and it says 3,000 miles to New York City, it's 3,000 miles to Columbus Circle. I'm going to put up something that I did with my last run. We're at the end now, but I'm at this junction for a little while. I'm just going to put up my little graph of my run. There we go. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Like and subscribe if you have. I hope some of the information has been useful. I will thank Untapped Cities for a lot of the information. The quirky information they give is the kind of stuff that I like. Thank you again. Take care.